In 1886, the United States Army had 5,000 soldiers hunting one man. One man and 36 warriors. For months, those 36 fighters evaded the largest manhunt in American military history across some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. And the U.S. government was terrified. His name was Geronimo. And this is the story of how one Apache warrior became the most wanted man in America, and why even after surrendering, the U.S. government never truly defeated him. To understand Geronimo, you first have to understand the Apache. The Apache were not one nation. They were a collection of related bands, the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, and others. For centuries, they had lived across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico. They were desert survivors. In an environment that killed most people, scorching heat, almost no water, rattlesnakes, scorpions, near zero vegetation, the Apache thrived. They could run 70 miles in a day through mountain terrain that broke horses. They could survive for days without food or water. They knew every canyon, every spring, every escape route in hundreds of miles of wilderness. The Spanish tried to conquer them for 200 years. They failed. The Mexican government declared open war on the Apache and offered bounties paid in cash for Apache scalps, including women and children. Still, the Apache survived. They were not simply warriors, they were ghosts, appearing from nowhere, vanishing without a trace. And out of this world came one man who would become a legend that outlived his own lifetime. His birth name was Goyakla, one who yawns. He was born around 1829 in present-day New Mexico. He was a Chiricahua Apache, a husband, a father, and a fighter like any other man in his band. Then, in March 1851, everything changed. Mexican soldiers from the state of Sonora ambushed his camp when the men were away trading in a nearby town. When Geronimo returned, he found his mother, his wife, and his 3 children, all dead. He stood there in silence. He buried them, and something inside him died with them. From that moment forward, Goyakla transformed. He went to war against Mexico with a ferocity no one had seen before. He was so aggressive in battle, so seemingly impossible to kill, that Mexican soldiers began crying out to their patron saint for protection when they saw him coming. That saint's name was Geronimo, Jerome in English, Geronimo. The name his enemies gave him in fear became the name history remembered. He fought Mexico for years. Then, when the U.S. Army arrived and began pushing the Apache off their land, he turned his fury in a new direction. After the Civil War, the U.S. government began pushing aggressively into Apache territory. In 1871, the Camp Grant massacre shocked the nation. Over 140 Apache men, women, and children were killed by a mob of settlers and rival warriors while they slept under U.S. Army protection. Almost no one was convicted. The message was clear to every Apache. American protection meant nothing. For the next decade, the Apache fought back. Under leaders like Cochise, Victorio, and Geronimo, small bands of Apache warriors launched raids across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. They struck fast, disappeared into the mountains, and were nearly impossible to track. General George Crook, one of the most respected U.S. Army officers of the era, was sent to end the Apache resistance. He understood Apache tactics better than any officer before him. He even used Apache scouts to hunt Apache fighters. But every time the Army thought it had broken the Apache spirit, Geronimo escaped. In 1874, the U.S. government moved the Chiricahua Apache to a reservation in Arizona. Geronimo was forced onto the land he had spent his whole life fighting for. He lasted 2 years. Then he broke out, and the wars began again, harder, more desperate, more deadly than before. By 1885, Geronimo had broken out of the reservation for the last time. He took with him 35 warriors, 8 boys old enough to fight, and 101 women and children. The U.S. Army responded with 5,000 soldiers, nearly 1/4 of the entire active U.S. military at the time. Think about that number. 5,000 trained soldiers with modern rifles, supply lines, and telegraph communications against 35 fighters and their families in the mountains. And Geronimo evaded them for over a year. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. His fighters could cover 70 miles a day through terrain that exhausted horses. They lived on almost nothing. They left no trail that untrained eyes could follow. The army was humiliated. Newspapers across America ran front-page stories about Geronimo almost daily. He became the most famous and feared Native American in the country. Even when General Nelson Miles replaced Crook and poured more resources into the hunt, Geronimo stayed free. Finally, in September 1886, Geronimo agreed to meet with U.S. representatives in the Skeleton Canyon of Arizona. He was exhausted. His band was down to a handful of survivors. They had been hunted across hundreds of miles of desert. He looked at the American officer across from him and said, "I give myself up to you. Do with me what you please. I surrender." It was over. Or so the U.S. government thought. After his surrender, the U.S. government did something extraordinary and revealing. They were so afraid of Geronimo that they sent him to a prison in Florida, not a reservation, a military prison, 2,000 miles from his homeland. His entire band, warriors, women, children, even Apache scouts who had helped the U.S. Army track him, were all sent to prison with him. He never went home. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. But something unexpected happened. Geronimo became famous, not as an enemy, but as a symbol. Americans who had spent years terrified of him now lined up to shake his hand. He sold autographed photos of himself at fairs and exhibitions. He rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905, a prisoner of war, waving to cheering crowds in Washington, D.C. Roosevelt later wrote that Geronimo was the greatest Indian fighting man America had produced. The same government that imprisoned him put him on display as a national treasure. Geronimo asked Roosevelt for permission to return to Arizona before he died. Roosevelt said no. Geronimo died in February 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, still a prisoner of war, at approximately 79 years old. He had outlived every general who hunted him. He had outlived the war itself, but he never saw his homeland again. Today, Geronimo's name is woven into American culture in ways most people never stop to think about. U.S. paratroopers yell his name when they jump from planes. The military's operation to find Osama bin Laden was codenamed Geronimo. His face appears on posters, murals, and film. A man the U.S. government imprisoned and exiled became one of the most iconic figures in American history. The Chiricahua Apache, his people, were held as prisoners of war for 27 years. They were finally released in 1913, 4 years after Geronimo's death. Many chose to remain in Oklahoma rather than return to land that had been taken from them entirely. But the Apache nation survives. Their descendants live across Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma today. And every time someone yells, "Geronimo," whether they know it or not, they are speaking the name of a man who refused for his entire life to accept that his people's story was over. If Geronimo's story moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, did you know paratroopers still shout Geronimo's name today? Drop a yes or no below. I read every single one. Follow this page, because the stories we were never taught in school, we're telling them here.